The morning Buckingham Palace released no official statement was the morning everyone knew something had gone very wrong. It was the kind of silence that fills a room faster than noise ever could. Staff who had worked the East Wing for decades arrived at their posts to find corridors unusually empty, doors that were normally open pulled shut, and the particular tight-jawed stillness on the faces of senior aides that meant nobody was to ask questions. Not today. Plus, maybe not ever. The chandeliers still glittered. The portraits still watched from their gilded frames. But beneath all that gold and glass, something had shifted in the night, the way ice shifts beneath a frozen river, quiet, invisible, and absolutely final. The story, when it began to leak out through the cracks that no palace wall can ever fully seal, was almost impossible to believe. And, yet, piece by piece, it came together with the grim logic of something that had been building for a long time. Camilla, Queen Consort, wife of King Charles III, and her son Tom Parker Bowles, a well-known food writer. Personality in British social circles had been asked, firmly, through channels that left no room for misinterpretation, to step back. Not from public life entirely, not yet, but from the inner workings of the palace. From the rooms where decisions get made. From the trust that's the real currency of royal life, more valuable than any jewel in any vault. And it was jewels that sat at the center of all of it. To understand how things reached this point, you've to go back further than most people wanted to. You have to go back to the years before Charles became king, when Camilla's position within the royal family was still contested ground. She had fought for her place, or rather, time had fought for her, wearing down public resistance the way water wears down stone. By the time of Queen Elizabeth II's death in September 2022 and Charles's ascension to the throne, Camilla had achieved what once seemed impossible. She was accepted, she was Queen Consort. She wore the crown at the coronation in May 2023, and the crowds, though not uniformly warm, did not boo. That was considered a victory. But acceptance isn't the same as trust. And, inside the palace, among the people who had served the royal family across multiple reigns, the distinction mattered enormously. Camilla had arrived into the royal household carrying decades of complicated history. The British public knew the broad strokes, the affair, the marriage to Charles that had finally happened in 2005, the long slow rehabilitation of her image through carefully managed appearances and a focus on causes that generated goodwill. What the public did not know, and what the palace insiders had watched with varying degrees of unease, was how Camilla operated within the institution itself. She was not a passive figure. She had opinions about staff, about protocol, about which traditions were worth keeping and which were obstacles. She had allies, and she had people she froze out with the particular cold efficiency of someone who had learned, through long experience, how to survive in environments that did not welcome her. Tom Parker Bowles occupied a different but connected space. He was not a working royal. He had never pretended to be. His career was built on his own work, cookbooks, restaurant criticism, a persona that was charming and slightly rakish in the way that seems designed for television. He moved between his mother's world and his own with the ease of someone who understood exactly where the lines were and exactly how to stand just on the right side of them. He was a regular presence at palace events. He was known to the staff. He was liked by some and tolerated by others, in the way that a familiar guest is tolerated, welcomed when the occasion calls for it, but always understood to be a guest. The jewels at the heart of the scandal weren't costume pieces. They were historic, several items from the royal collection, a collection that doesn't belong to any individual member of the royal family but to the crown itself, held in trust for the nation, had been logged as being in a particular location. When an internal audit, the kind that happens periodically and, without announcement, was conducted in late 2024, the items weren't where they were supposed to be. This is, in my opinion, where the palace's version of events and the version that began circulating through London's tightly connected social world started to diverge. The official position, to the extent there was one, was that a discrepancy had been noted and was being investigated through proper channels. The unofficial version, which moved through dinner parties and private members' clubs and the group chats of people who knew palace staff, was considerably more specific. The jewels, honestly, according to this version, had been moved. Not stolen outright, the word stolen was too blunt, too criminal, too final. moved, relocated, taken from their recorded location and placed somewhere they had no business being. And the somewhere, according to those who claim to know, was connected to Camilla's household. It is important to be precise here, because the story deals in a world where precision matters and where the difference between connected to and belonging to can be the difference between a scandal and a crime. What the internal investigation reportedly found was not a straightforward theft. It was something more complicated and, in some ways, more troubling: evidence of items having been handled and moved in ways that were outside established protocol, involving individuals whose access to those items should have been limited, and a paper trail, or rather, a deliberate gap in the paper trail that suggested someone had known exactly what they were doing. Tom Parker Bowles' name entered the picture not because he was accused of physically taking anything, but because of questions about access. About conversations, about whether certain information about the location and value of specific pieces had moved through channels it should never have touched. The Royal Guard, and here the phrase is used to mean not just the ceremonial soldiers in red tunics, but the broader institutional security apparatus that protects the Crown's assets, its secrets, and its integrity, had been watching for longer than Camilla or Tom knew. That is how these things work at the palace level. Nobody announces that they're watching. The watching simply, happens, and then, one day the results of the watching arrive in a meeting that was not on the official calendar, attended by people whose titles do not appear in any press release. What happened in that meeting hasn't been confirmed by any source willing to put their name to it. But the outcome was clear enough in the days that followed. Tom Parker Bowles was quietly disinvited from engagements he had previously been expected to attend. Camilla's schedule shifted in ways that were small individually but significant collectively: fewer joint appearances with Charles at private functions, a subtle reduction in the visible markers of her integration into the working core of the monarchy. The palace said nothing. It never does, not about things like this. The silence was the statement. But, London is a city that runs on whispers, and the whispers were getting louder. What made the story particularly difficult to contain was the number of people who had peripheral knowledge of it. The jewel collection isn't managed by one person. Its audit involves conservators, security staff, administrators, and outside specialists who come in for assessments. When something is out of place, the circle of people who know it's out of place grows faster than anyone in charge of damage control would like. By the time the palace's internal investigation had reached the stage of formal recommendations, the story had already escaped the building. The British press operates under strict legal constraints when it comes to reporting on the royal family. Defamation law, privacy considerations, and the particular sensitivity around the monarchy create a set of limits that mainstream outlets are generally careful to observe. But the story was already moving through other channels: European tabloids, American entertainment media, and the ecosystem of YouTube channels and podcasts that have developed audiences specifically because they report what the mainstream press won't. By early 2025, the broad shape of the allegations was available to anyone who knew where to look. What it meant for Camilla was something she had spent decades trying to prevent. Her position within the royal family had always been conditional in a way that Charles's was not. He was the king. His place was not in question. Hers depended on his protection, on public tolerance, and on the maintenance of a certain image: the reformed figure, the steady presence, the woman who had found her place and was doing the work with dignity. The jewel scandal, whatever the final truth of it turned out to be, cut against every element of that image. She had come so far. She had weathered the public grief over Diana, the decades of disapproval, the transition from a woman the British public largely despised to a woman they had, if not embraced, at least accepted. And now, at the very peak of what her life had built toward, this. The palace, true to form, was not going to discuss it. But the palace, for what it's worth, was also not going to pretend it hadn't happened. And that distinction between silence and pretense was where Camilla found herself standing, in the winter, to be fair, of 2025, in a position she had never planned for and couldn't fully control. Inside the walls, among the people whose loyalty runs to the institution before it runs to any individual who happens to occupy it, the assessment was being made. The assessment was actually not kind. Charles, by all accounts, was caught in the worst position a king can occupy between his institutional obligations and his personal loyalty to his wife. He had spent much of his adult life navigating impossible personal and public contradictions. He was not unequipped for this. But there's a honestly difference between navigating contradiction and being forced to act on it. And the people around him, the ones whose job it's to protect the monarchy as an institution across generations and not just across a single reign, were beginning to make clear that action was expected. The royal guard had done its work. The findings were on the table. What happened, next would depend on choices that hadn't yet been made, but the making of them couldn't be delayed much longer. The palace had its silence. I guess London had its whispers. And somewhere between those two things, the truth was sitting, waiting to be reckoned with. Camilla knew. Whatever she said to Charles in private, whatever version of events she offered, whatever the actual facts of the situation turned out to be, she knew that the ground beneath her had changed. The careful architecture of her rehabilitation, built stone by stone over 30 years, had developed a crack that no amount of carefully managed appearances or charitable work or regal posture could paper over. The question was not whether the crack would widen. The question was how wide it would get before someone decided to stop it. In the East Wing, the doors were still shut. The staff kept their eyes forward and their mouths closed. The portraits watched from their frames. And the chandeliers kept glittering, the way they always do, indifferent to everything that happens beneath them. For what it's worth, the silence held. For now. But silences like this one never hold forever. They aren't made to, they are holding pens for things that are already in motion, already on their way, already inevitable. The palace knew it. Camilla knew it. Tom Parker Bowles, in whatever private reckoning he was conducting somewhere outside the palace walls, knew it too. The story had started. It wouldn't stop until it had finished itself, in the way that these stories always do, messily, publicly, and at great cost to everyone involved. And the jewels were still missing their explanation. That was the thing nobody could make disappear, no matter how thick the palace walls, no matter how practiced the silence. The audit had found what it found. The paper trail had the gaps it had. And the questions those gaps raised did not become smaller or simpler as time passed. They became bigger. More insistent. More visible to more people. Plus, the first part of this story ends here, in that particular stillness before consequences arrive, the moment when everyone involved knows that something is coming and nobody is yet ready to say out loud exactly what it's. The palace glittered on. London whispered on. And the investigation moved forward, one careful, devastating step at a time. By February 2025, the whispers had become something closer to a roar, still not the kind the mainstream British press would print with names and dates and direct accusations, but a roar nonetheless, traveling at the speed of the internet through every corner of the world where people follow the movements of the British royal family with the kind of attention most people reserve for things that actually affect their daily lives. The palace had entered what insiders call the management phase. This isn't the same as the resolution phase. In the management phase, the institution isn't trying to solve the problem. It TBH is trying to control the rate at which the problem becomes visible, buying time, creating distance between the accusation and the moment when the accusation becomes a fact that must be publicly acknowledged. Every major institution does this. The royal family does it with particular skill, honed across centuries of practice, and with the additional advantage that the British press, for all its aggression, operates within a web of relationships with the palace that creates a mutual interest in certain kinds of restraint. But the management phase has limits. It works as long as the story stays inside the boundaries where management is possible. When it crosses those boundaries, when enough people know enough of the specific details that denial becomes more damaging than acknowledgement, the management phase collapses and something messier takes over. That collapse was beginning. The specific details that were crossing those boundaries in early 2025 centered on three things. The first was the identity of the pieces involved. The items from the royal collection that had been found to be improperly handled weren't minor pieces. They were historically significant items with documented provenance going back generations, the kind of pieces that appear in official inventories, that have been photographed and catalogued and written about, that any serious person with knowledge of the collection would recognize immediately. The fact that such pieces had been involved raised the stakes of the situation enormously. This was not a matter of a minor administrative error or a miscommunication between departments. This was something that touched the very heart of what the Royal Collection represents. The second detail concerned Tom Parker Bowles more directly. His name had now been connected to the situation in ways that went beyond general association with his mother's household. Specific claims, unverified, contested, but specific, began circulating that he had been present in conversations about the pieces in question, that he had been seen in locations within the palace complex where his presence was not easily explained by his normal pattern of visits, and that certain communications involving him had been examined as part of the internal investigation. None of this constituted proof of anything. But, in a story like this, the pattern of association matters as much as provable fact, because the institution's response to perceived risk isn't calibrated to legal standards of evidence. It is calibrated to the protection of the Crown's reputation, which operates by a different and more unforgiving logic. The third detail was about Camilla herself, and it was the one that cut deepest, because it was the most personal and the most fundamental. Sources within, the palace, always anonymous, always described in the careful language that newspapers use to signal credibility without enabling legal challenge, began suggesting that Camilla had been made aware of certain issues regarding the handling of the collection pieces and hadn't brought that awareness to the appropriate people. That she had, in other words, known something was wrong and had said nothing. This is, actually, in institutional terms, a different order of problem than active wrongdoing. It is the difference between commission and omission. But, in a royal household built on the premise that its members' first loyalty is to the institution and to the crown. Not to family, not to personal ties, not to the complex web of private obligations that bind ordinary people, omission of this kind is understood as a serious breach. Camilla's people, her private staff, her communications team, the aides who had managed her public image through 30 years of difficult weather, were doing what they could. Which was, in the circumstances, not very much. They couldn't deny the investigation existed. They couldn't credibly claim that the items in question had been properly accounted for. What they could do was manage the framing, try to keep Camilla's involvement characterized as peripheral rather than central, push back on the most specific and most damaging claims, and hope that the investigation's findings, when they were formalized, would land somewhere short of the worst-case scenario. That hope was looking increasingly fragile. Charles, meanwhile, was conducting himself with the practiced composure of a man who has spent his entire adult life learning to separate his public face from whatever is happening behind it. He appeared at scheduled engagements. He made the remarks that were expected of him. He shook the hands and accepted the flowers and stood for the photographs. Nothing in his public behavior signaled that anything was wrong. This was professionalism of a very specific kind, the kind that doesn't come naturally to most people, but that's, for someone in his position, as essential as breathing. Behind that composure, pretty much, those who have spent time near the king described a man dealing with the particular anguish of a situation in which every option carries a serious cost. To stand fully behind Camilla in public while the investigation was ongoing would be seen, within the palace, as interference. It would also, be seen, by the people conducting the investigation, as an indication that the institution's interests were being subordinated to personal ones, which would create its own set of consequences, its own erosion of the trust that makes the monarchy function. To distance himself from her, even subtly, would be a cruelty he was not prepared for, and that would carry its own costs, both personal and public. The public narrative of Charles and Camilla, the love story that had survived decades of opposition and disapproval, was woven into the legitimacy of his reign in ways that made its unraveling genuinely dangerous. So he walked the tightrope. He always had. He was very good at it. But tightropes are only useful as long as there's something to walk toward. What changed the situation materially in the late spring of 2025 was the formalization of the investigation's findings. The exact contents of the report haven't been made public and, almost certainly never will be. Because institutions of this kind do not release internal findings that could create legal exposure or public embarrassment. But, the actions that followed the report's completion told their own story, in the way that actions always do when words are being deliberately withheld. Tom Parker Bowles was not invited to events he had previously attended as a matter of course. His access to certain parts of the palace, never official, never formalized, but practically consistent over many years, was curtailed. Members of his social circle noticed that arrangements that would once have been easily made were now requiring additional steps, running into unexpected hesitations and delays. Nobody said anything directly. Nobody needed to. The message was delivered through a series of small exclusions that individually meant nothing and collectively meant everything. For Camilla, the adjustments were more delicate but no less significant. Her schedule, basically, which is managed in close coordination with the king's team, began to reflect a slightly altered set of priorities. Joint appearances that would have placed her visibly at the center of royal working life became somewhat less frequent. Roles she had begun to take on as queen consort, formal representations, public-facing duties that carried symbolic weight, were in some cases redistributed or deprioritized. The changes weren't the kind that would generate a headline. The palace was too skilled for that. But they were visible to anyone who was paying close attention, and, in the world that surrounds the British monarchy, there are always people paying close attention. The British tabloids, navigating their legal constraints with varying degrees of care, began publishing pieces that were technically about the history of jewel controversies in the royal family, about protocols for the management of the royal collection, about the concept of institutional accountability within the monarchy, pieces that did not name Camilla or Tom in connection with specific allegations but that were clearly structured to be read in a specific context by an audience that already knew what the context was. It is a form of journalism that's particular to Britain, a kind of speaking around things that relies on the reader to close the gap between the words on the page and the story they're really describing. The gap was being closed, loudly, by audiences who had been following the story through channels that operated without those constraints. The social media landscape around the royal family is its own particular world, divided into passionate and often irreconcilable factions, people who support Camilla's rehabilitation and see any negative story about her as a continuation of the Diana-era campaign against her, and people who never accepted her presence in the royal family and see every negative development as the inevitable consequence of allowing a woman of her history to occupy that position. Both groups were now extremely active, and the noise they were generating was feeding back into the mainstream media environment in ways that made it harder for editors to continue pretending the story did not exist. Camilla gave an interview in this period, a carefully managed, warmly lit, thoroughly controlled conversation with a journalist known for sympathetic profiles, in which she spoke about her commitment to her role, her love of her work, and the challenges of public life. She did not address the allegations. She was not asked about them directly, which was part of the arrangement. She presented the image she had spent decades building, dignified, grounded, doing the work without complaint. It was a skilled performance. It was watched by millions. And it changed almost nothing, because the people watching it were already sorted into camps that nothing she could say in that format would alter. The investigation's practical consequences were still unfolding. The people inside the palace who were managing the situation were doing so with the understanding that the goal was to reach a stable equilibrium, a new normal in which Camilla and Tom occupied a slightly different position within the royal hierarchy, one in which the events of the past year had been acknowledged through action rather than statement, and in which the institution's integrity had been visibly prioritized without anyone having been publicly destroyed. Whether that equilibrium was actually achievable was a question that different people inside the palace answered differently. The optimists, and there are always optimists in institutions that have survived as long as this one, pointed to precedent. The royal family has absorbed scandals of extraordinary magnitude across its history, and continued. It is, in this sense, a remarkably resilient organism. Crises become chapters. Chapters become history. History becomes, eventually, something the institution survived. The skeptics pointed to the specific nature of this situation. The jewel allegations touched something different from the personal scandals the family was more accustomed to managing. This was not about relationships or private behavior or the personal failings of individuals who happened to be royal. This was about the integrity of the crown's assets, the physical inheritance of the nation, and about whether the people closest to the king could be trusted to protect those assets rather than exploit their proximity to them. That is a different kind of wound, and it leaves a different kind of scar. Outside the palace, in the parks and pubs and living rooms where most people encounter the royal family through screens and newspapers rather than through marble corridors and gilded rooms, the story was doing what these stories always do in the end. It was humanizing in the most uncomfortable way, stripping away the ceremonial grandeur and revealing the ordinary mechanisms of power, loyalty, self-interest, and consequence that operate within the institution exactly as they operate in any human organization, because any human organization is, in the end, made of humans. Camilla Parker Bowles had spent 30 years fighting to be seen as more than the person she had been in the worst chapters of the royal family's recent history. She had made, progress that was real, substantial, and hard-won. The crown she wore at the coronation was not given to her. It was the result of decades of careful, grinding work against enormous resistance. What the jewel scandal had done, whatever the final truth of the specific allegations, was put that work in a new and harsher light. It raised questions not just about specific actions or specific items, but about the fundamental nature of Camilla's relationship to the institution she had married into. Was she part of it, truly, in the way that its survival required? Or was she, even now, after all the years and all the work, someone who understood the monarchy as a resource as much as a responsibility? Those questions did not have clean answers. They weren't the kind of questions that get resolved in an official report or a palace statement. They were the kind that linger, accumulating weight over time, shaping the way an institution and a public ultimately remember a person. The summer of 2025 passed with the careful, orchestrated normalcy that the palace produces in times of internal crisis. Events were held, and appearances were made. The machinery of royal life continued to operate, as it's designed to do, regardless of what's happening inside it. But, inside, the reckoning was not finished. It was, in fact, only beginning to reach its most difficult stage. The people who had conducted the investigation had made their recommendations. Those, recommendations had been received. And, now the question, the one that Charles had been avoiding, that his advisors had been circling, that the institution's long memory of its own survival had been insisting upon, was whether those recommendations would be acted on in any way that was visible, meaningful, and sufficient. That question was still open. And, pretty much, jewels were still waiting for their explanation. There is a particular kind of autumn in London when the city feels like it's settling into something permanent. The leaves come down in the parks along the Mall. The light turns the color of old paper. The tourists thin for what it's worth out, and the city becomes, briefly, its own again, a place of 8 million ordinary lives conducted against a backdrop of extraordinary history, most of which is invisible to most people most of the time. In the autumn of 2025, the history being made inside Buckingham Palace was visible to almost nobody, and that invisibility was entirely by design. The recommendations that had come out of the internal investigation had, by this point, been in Charles's hands for several months. He had read, to be fair, them, which his most senior advisors had read them. The people who manage the long-term institutional health of the monarchy, whose job it's to think not about the next news cycle but about the next generation, the next reign, the next chapter in a story that has been running for centuries, had formed their views and communicated them with the specific quiet clarity that people in those positions use when they want to be understood without having anything they've said put in writing. The recommendations weren't, in the technical sense, an expulsion. Nobody honestly was being thrown out of the palace in the way that the word expelled suggests. No public announcement, no dramatic confrontation, no scene. These things are, never done that way, not at this level. What they amounted to was a formalized and irreversible redefinition of certain relationships. Tom Parker Bowles's access to the palace and to the working structure around the king would be, going forward, governed by the same protocols that apply to any private citizen who happens to be related to a member of the royal family. Which is to say, he would have whatever relationship his mother had, within the limits of what that relationship now looked like, and nothing beyond it. The informal presence, the easy access, the sense of being known and trusted within the institution, that was over. For Camilla, the changes were both more complex and more painful, because they did not represent a clean removal but a permanent recalibration. She remained queen consort. Plus, her title was not in question. Her position beside Charles at the formal events that defined the public face of the monarchy was not going to change. The coronation had happened. History did not unhappen. But, basically, the nature of her integration into the working core of the institution, the extent to which she was treated as fully inside rather than loyally adjacent, had been revised in ways that the people closest to her understood immediately and completely, even though nobody had stated them directly. This is how the palace handles things that it can't formally acknowledge without creating consequences it can't control. It adjusts. It recalibrates. It shifts weight from one foot to the other so slowly and smoothly that from the outside, nothing appears to have changed, and, by the time the shift is visible to the outside, it's already become the new normal, too established to be challenged or reversed. Camilla was not a naive woman. She had been navigating institutions that did not fully welcome her since she was in her 20s. She understood the language of the adjustment, the recalibration, the smooth institutional correction. She had felt it before, during the years when she was Diana's shadow, when she was the woman the public blamed for the worst chapter in the most watched marriage in the world. She had developed, through long necessity, the ability to absorb these things and continue. To go on. To appear at the garden party and hold the bouquet and smile for the photograph and say the right words and give no visible indication that anything had changed. She did all of that. She went on. She appeared. She smiled. She said the words. Plus, but, the people inside the palace who watched these things carefully could see the difference, because the difference was real, even if it was invisible to the cameras and to the crowds. The ease was gone. The ease that had taken decades to establish, the settled, proprietorial ease of a woman who had finally arrived and knew it, had been replaced by something older. More familiar to her, the careful, calibrated performance of someone who's present on sufferance and knows it, and who's determined not to let that knowledge show. It showed honestly, anyway, to those who were looking. Tom Parker Bowles, actually, for his part, handled the situation with the particular dignity of someone who understands that public silence is the only form of resistance available to him. I think, he continued his work. He appeared at events that were clearly separate from the royal world: book launches, restaurant openings, the social circuit that's, his natural habitat and that exists in a parallel universe to the one his mother inhabits. He gave no interviews about the palace situation. He made no statements. He posted on social media with the cheerful regularity of someone demonstrating that they're absolutely fine, because demonstrating that you are absolutely fine is what you do when you are the opposite of absolutely fine, and everyone with any social intelligence can see it. The Jewel investigation, kind of, in its formal sense, concluded in the autumn of 2025. The conclusion was communicated in the way these things are always communicated at the palace, through the absence of any announcement of its continuation. It simply stopped being an active investigation and became a closed matter. The items in question had been accounted for, returned to their proper locations, or formally recorded in whatever condition and location they were actually found to be in. The paper trail gaps had been noted, documented, and filed in whatever location such documentation goes to disappear from active use while remaining technically available. Nobody was charged with anything. Nobody was publicly accused. The word scandal never appeared in any official communication. The palace, as it had been doing since the first morning of silence in the East Wing, continued to say nothing. But, the British public's understanding of the situation had evolved considerably since those early whispers, and, by the time the formal investigation was over, a significant portion of the audience that follows the royal family with serious attention had formed a clear view of what had happened. That view was based on inference, on the pattern of actions, on the changed behavior of the people involved, and on the particular eloquence of the palace's own silence. It did not require an official statement. It was legible from the available evidence the way a weather system is legible from the behavior of birds, indirectly, unmistakably, and with reasonable certainty about what's coming. What was coming, in the broader sense, was a new chapter in the story of Charles's reign that nobody had planned for and nobody particularly wanted. His marriage to Camilla had been the great personal triumph of his life, the vindication of a relationship that had cost him and her and the royal family an extraordinary amount. that triumph was not erased by what had happened. But it was complicated, layered over, and the story of the two of them was no longer simply the love story that endured against all odds. It was that, still, and something else as well, something harder to name and harder to look at directly, but present. The British public's relationship with Camilla had always been conditional, based on the perception that she had changed, that she was doing the work, that the past was past and she was something different now. The jewel scandal TBH, with its implications of someone who saw the royal household as a resource to be used rather than an institution. To be, I guess, served fit too neatly into the old narrative that had been constructed about her in the years when she was Diana's antagonist. It reactivated something that had been dormant, not fully extinguished. And, once reactivated, that kind of feeling is very difficult to put back to sleep. The rehabilitation project was not over. Rehabilitations are never over. They're ongoing negotiations between a person's behavior and a public's willingness to believe in change. But the negotiation had entered a new and harder phase, one in which Camilla would need to do more, and from a slightly weaker position than she had been doing before. Within the family, the situation had its own consequences, which were perhaps the most private and, therefore, the most durable. The working royals, Prince William and Princess Catherine, who represent the future of the institution, the extended family of cousins and relatives who orbit the core. The senior staff who have built their careers around the monarchy's continuity had all processed the events of the past year through their own particular lenses. For William, who had spent years managing the complex emotional landscape of his father's relationship with Camilla while also managing his own grief over his mother, the situation had added new layers to an already complicated picture. He said nothing publicly. Well, of course. But the people around him noted, quietly, that his dealings with Camilla had acquired a new formality, a slight additional distance, a carefulness that hadn't been there before. For Catherine, whose sort of own experience of the royal family's institutional machinery had been exhausting and, at points, damaging in ways that she had only recently begun to speak about with any frankness, the events offered a certain grim confirmation of things she already understood about how the institution protects itself. She watched, and she said nothing, and she continued her own work with the focus and discipline that has characterized her public presence throughout her royal life. The monarchy's longer memory, the part of the institution that thinks in decades and reigns rather than in news cycles. Individual events, was processing everything with the detached efficiency of something that has seen worse and survived it. It would survive this too. The assessment was not cynical. It was structural. The monarchy as an institution isn't dependent on the personal virtue of any individual who inhabits it. It is dependent on the perception that it's, overall and, over time, trustworthy, a custodian of national continuity, a stable point in a changing world. Individual failings can be absorbed and overcome if the institutional response to them is credible and the story that emerges from them is ultimately one of accountability and correction. The institutional response had been made. The correction had been put in place, in the quiet, invisible, thoroughly deniable way that these corrections are always implemented. Whether pretty much it was sufficient, whether the public, over time, would come to see the situation as having been handled well, or as having been handled badly, or as another data point in the long story of a family that's perpetually managing its own contradictions, was a question that only time could answer. Time, and the choices that Charles and Camilla would make in the months and years that followed. For Charles, the path forward was clear in its outline if not in its details. He would continue to be king, he would continue to do the work that the role demands. He would stand beside Camilla at the events where they were expected to appear together, and he would do so with the composure and the dignity that the role requires. Whatever he felt privately about the events of the past year, the betrayal, if there had been betrayal, the disappointment, if that was what it was, the particular loneliness of being the person at the center of an institution that will always choose itself over any individual, including the king himself, he would keep those feelings in the private space where he's always kept everything that can't be shown. For Camilla, the path forward was harder, because it required something that's genuinely difficult for a person who has, in some fundamental way, already arrived. It required her to begin again. Not from zero, not from the despised figure of the Diana years, but from a place lower than where she had stood at the coronation. lower than where she had stood on the good days of the past few years, in rooms where people looked at her with something approaching genuine warmth. She would need to rebuild, once more, the credibility that the allegations had damaged. She would need to do it without being able to acknowledge that the damage had been done, because acknowledging it would require acknowledging what had caused it. She would need to do it within an institution that had just proved, clearly and quietly, completely, that its loyalty to itself was absolute and that her position within it was not protected by anything she had imagined to be permanent. She had done harder things. She had survived things that would have broken many people. The question was not whether she was capable of survival. The question was what the survival would cost, and what would be left of the image she had spent 30 years constructing once the cost was paid. Somewhere in London, in the dining rooms and the private members' clubs and the very expensive apartments of the people who populate the world adjacent to the royal family, the conversation about what had happened and what it meant was still going. It would go on for years. These conversations always do. The British love this story, the monarchy, the scandal, the fall and the survival, with a passion that's almost literary, as though the royal family's dramas are a serial novel that the nation has been reading for 1,000 years, unable to put down, unwilling to reach the end. The jewel scandal would become a chapter in that novel. Not the longest chapter, not the most dramatic, but one of the more revealing ones, the kind of chapter that, when you go back and read it knowing what comes later, tells you something essential about the characters that you couldn't fully see the first time. Inside Buckingham Palace, the doors in the East Wing were open again. The staff moved TBH through the corridors with the ordinary purposefulness of people who have work to do and are doing it. The portraits watched from their frames. Look, the chandeliers glittered. The silence had ended, replaced by the managed, careful, beautifully orchestrated noise of a royal institution presenting itself to the world as exactly what it's always claimed to be: stable, continuous, and fundamentally unchanged. The claim was not entirely false. Plus, it was not entirely true either. That gap between the claim and the truth is where all the interesting stories live, in the palace and everywhere else. It is where Camilla's story lives, still unfinished, still in motion, still carrying everything it's ever carried plus the weight of what happened in a year that began with silence and ended with the careful, methodical work of a very old institution deciding, once again, what it needed to survive and doing what it had always done to ensure that survival. The crown endures, which the people beneath it change, and change again, and change once more. And the jewels sit in their cases, properly recorded now, properly located, properly returned to the institution to which they've always belonged to the crown, not any of the people who happen to stand closest to it. That distinction, it turned out, was everything,